Right, so for the past 5 weeks or so, we've been working with Anne from the EAL Academy here in Peterborough. We're a very large comprehensive school with 65 different languages spoken, so we wanted to focus on how students can better use academic English, particularly in the sixth form, because we felt that some of them were really struggling, particularly when they got into exam questions and when they were writing coursework, to make sure that they were sounding like a historian or sounding like a scientist. So we've been working with Richard, who is a history teacher and teaches a lot of Key Stage 5. And together we co-planned 2 lessons. I taught one, even though I'm an English teacher, and it seemed to go quite well. Anne came and gave us some new ideas about how we could use talk as preparation for writing, in particular pairing students up and getting them to take one side of an argument and then present their opinion and use language effectively to sound convincing and authoritative, and then to turn that into a piece of writing that in an exam situation would get them some of the top marks.
Okay, so what we're going to look at today is the October Revolution. We're going to go back to that and we're going to be doing some work on the transverse that you were doing before with Mrs. Holly and Anne. And this time we're going to be really focusing on this idea of the line of argument. Particularly useful when you're looking at your coursework, because you've got to have this very, very strong line of argument, not to discount other points of view, but it's really important to get off the fence and to actually have a line of argument. Now, first thing I'd like you to do, just to get your brains in gear, is we've already looked at the October Revolution already. We've had a look at the major events happening between February and October, both in terms of the successes of the Bolsheviks, but also the sort of the negative aspects of the provisional government and the weaknesses of those. Now, what I'd like you to do is, please, the photo in front of you, we've got a continuum along the wall. And what I'd like is your starting position somewhere along this from the Bolsheviks won because the provisional government's weaknesses. And you can see there's, to a large extent, or mainly, to a considerable extent, to some extent, to a limited extent. And we've got the midpoint all the way up to lovely Lenin with the Bolsheviks won because of their own intrinsic strength. So what I'd like you to do is just take your photo and just place it somewhere on that continuum, please. So it's either the positive aspects of Lenin and the Bolsheviks, or it's the negative aspects of the provisional government. Okay, so if we look at the continuum then, we seem to have more people move towards the sort of the failings of the provisional government. Would anybody, we've got the boys there going to some extent, so they're the most sure that it's the provisional government. Would anyone like to explain why you've chosen to put your face just there?
So like, there's like so many reasons for like why the provisional government is so disjointed. It's not like a unified force. Like the whites aren't like a unified force, and like the reds, they've got a lot stronger leadership. They all sort of believe in.
Just take a pause there. Remember, what we're thinking about is this before the Civil War. Okay, so this is how the provisional government fell apart. So the provisional government took over in February 1917. And it was beset by weaknesses right from day one, if you remember. The problems of legitimacy, mistakes that they made, if you think about the 3 main events. So would anybody like to explain why they put themselves more to do with the sort of benefits of Bolshevism? What is Bolshevism offering people in Russia? Sarah, you put to a considerable extent.
Because like the provisional did have weaknesses, but I think like the Bolsheviks, because they had good leadership, they utilised like the weakness as well.
Can anyone remember what changed about Lenin throughout 1917? How did his tactics change after returning in April?
Wasn't it that they became more planned?
Definitely very organised. Okay, so when we think about the July days, that was the opposite of the way that he operates. He operates in a very, very organised way. So the idea of running around, rioting was totally anathema to him. So yeah, so that's really important. What else did Lenin start to do throughout 1917, which he'd never done before? In terms of the way that he was operating as a politician. Can you remember? Now, if you remember, before 1917, Before 1917, he'd always been an ideologue, someone sat in small rooms, small dusty rooms, preaching to the converted. So what had changed when he returned? Talia? Yeah, so it became more of a mass party. So again, he was appealing to a lot of different people. What's happening to his language?
Well, he simplified it.
Everything was simplified, yeah, absolutely. So he reduced everything down to small little slogans, the way that we think of modern politicians today. So instead of talking, very ideologically about Marxism and things like that, it was peace, land and bread. Very simple, and people weren't interested in how this was going to be achieved. At the time, in 1917, this was the reason that people were going, okay, we'll listen to him, we'll see what he's got to say. Now, what I'd like us to do is to do a little bit of reading just to refresh where we're at. Now, we've got groups A and B. What I'd like is, everybody's got the same article. It's from the book that I've recommended enough times, with the sort of little essays in there written by a head of history from Bromsgrove. So it's the question that we started with: why were the Bolsheviks able to overthrow the provisional government in October 1917? Now what I'd like is Group A, so if your name's here, I'd like you to focus just on the first one, which is the weakness of the provisional government. So we're sort of heading towards that side. We're trying to focus on that particular argument. And Group B here, what I'd like you to do is have a look on a couple of pages along, which is just here, the organisational strengths of the Bolsheviks. So we're just dividing up these two very different arguments between those who are arguing very strongly in favour of this. So we're going to spend about 10 minutes reading through your article. If you need to borrow a highlighter, please help yourself to a highlighter. And we're just trying to pick out the most important details that we're then going to transverse this idea of trying to persuade the other side with your ideas.
Then, so we're going to do the same transverse activity that we did before. So we're going to stand in two lines with the A's and the B's opposite each other, and stand opposite somebody you feel comfortable talking to for this first one, okay? But I think we're going to be short, so come on. Need everybody standing. Here. So are you an A or a B? Which one? B. So B's on this side then. B? B, okay. Team A, okay. Team A here. You an A? Excellent. A B, okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, what I've done, just to give you a few pointers, just some of the things that you might think about. So if you think about some of the weaknesses, the legitimacy, the problems of the provisional government is obviously something. Soviet order number one, this dual authority, dual government is another. And then we've got some of the things that Lenin does, the April thesis, some of the positive sort of sloganeering. But then we've got these three major events which are equally balanced between being awful for the provisional government but being really positive for the Bolsheviks. So they make the most of each of these three events. So I'll just put those up there just to give you a little pointer.
Great.
So I'm going to be with Saif.
Okay, lovely. And I just want to say as well, I know you're holding on to your notes. Don't feel you have to look at them. You're, young historians, and you have a right to express your point of view. That's absolutely fine. And also feel free to disagree. That's absolutely fine, okay? So you don't have to agree. You can argue your point and you can change your mind. That's good. Okay, so off you go. Take it in turns to start and put your point of view.
Saif, tell me all about the Bolsheviks then.
I admit that there is a lot of weaknesses within the government, but I believe that because of the strengths, it was dominant, and because of that, it was that weaknesses were exploited.
So could you give me an example of the Bolsheviks?
There's a lot of order and there's a lot of organisation, whereas if you compare it with the government, it was opposite.
Yeah.
So I believe that because of that, the weaknesses were easily exploited and they were shown out.
So you think that it's positive, so they understand the weaknesses and they expose them and they benefit from it right from the start. Now I would say, being a team A, I would say that clearly they're in complete disarray. So the Bolsheviks just get lucky because they've got nobody there who are sort of doing anything about it. They're just, from day one, they've got a problem of legitimacy. Nobody knows who they are, nobody trusts who they are. They're just a group of people who've decided to seize the power after Soviet order number one is, keeps one hand tied behind their back all the way through. So even though the Bolsheviks certainly made the most of it, I'd say they were lucky.
So I'm not sure if you could say lucky, because if it wasn't for luck, I don't think it would make so far. So if it was for luck, it would have stopped at some point. So I say, even though there was a dominant figurehead, it was still organisation, which meant that, without a class, without a teacher, you could still work on this.
Can you remember the V word that we talked about with the Bolsheviks? The vanguard. Being an organised, deeply organised party, everything. And this is the thing with Lenin, I don't want to argue your point, but this is the thing with Lenin. Everything is meticulously planned and organised. Everything is ticked down to the very, very finest. But if you think about the June offensive, so this idea of pushing Germany and Austria-Hungary out of Russia and then sealing up the borders, it was an absolute disaster for the provisional government. They didn't really know how to fight a war properly.
Okay, all right, then leave it there for now, and I'm going to take one of the A's. This is you, isn't it? I'm going to walk you down the middle. So everybody on the A side is going to move up one. So now you've got a new partner.
What did Lenin? She's convincing you otherwise.
No, that's my emphasis.
Okay, tell me what's so appealing about Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Yeah, I think this nationalism, because in political terms, nationalism here, socialism is the opposite. So what he did, he used these sort of ideas, the sort of sloganeering, nationalism, and became a sort of populist party in the same way that you could see it today in people like Donald Trump and Jeremy Corbyn, who've got these ideas and they're appealing to people in very simple terms. I think that's what Lenin does really successfully. And this is the big difference between what had happened before. Before, he was a politician who'd speak in small rooms. He'd speak in ideological language that people couldn't really understand, but he was preaching to the converted. What happened during 1917 was that he kept all of that detail, that meticulous planning, but just had this populist edge, this sort of, let's slogan here, let's make things easy for people to understand.
Make you move one more time, okay? So if you'd like to come through. And you're going to move.
Bye, guys.
So this is your last
Michael?
If you
Okay.
could address any issues you haven't touched on so far. So anything you haven't talked about so far.
Okay, now the reason I'd say it is a provisional government is because Lenin and the Bolsheviks were largely lucky because they managed to find the country in such a sense of disarray. So right from day one, nobody trusted them. They weren't revolutionary. They were just the old people, seemingly the old princes who are now taking charge. And they weren't able to make decisions, particularly about the war, because of Soviet order number one. So as a result, when the June offensive took place, they were trying to operate with one arm tied behind their back, which is why it went horribly wrong. And Lenin then took advantage of all of those mistakes. So ultimately, chicken and egg.
I agree with what you're saying. I think that the provisional government didn't actually do anything or the Bolsheviks, didn't actually do anything to gain the support. They just used what the provisional government had done in order to worsen themselves, and then Lenin just rode off the back. So like you said, with how much people hated the war effort, all they did really was just kind of listen to that.
I think what Lenin had going for him was his tactics changed. If he'd kept to just talking to small people, the vanguard, this elite party, in small little smoky rooms, they'd have got nowhere. But he kept all of those tactics, the idea of having it meticulously planned, having everything sorted out, but added to it this populist feel. Again, I was talking to Kieran just about him turning into sort of Donald Trump, where he's appealing to big crowds with these very easy to understand slogans. If you've had 4 years of terrible war and someone's coming along saying peace, I'll listen.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. Thank you very much. Sorry if you were in the middle in full space. And while you're still standing here, it was really hard for me to get around today because we're fenced in by desks. But I did hear some really good thinking, I have to say. I overheard somebody say, yes, but Lenin exploited the weaknesses of the other party. I thought that was a very good way of putting it. I'm sorry I didn't get around to more of you. But can I quickly capture what it was like to do this for the second time? What was it like? Good. Go on, easier. Go on.
So we know what to do this time, as we did before.
So that made it a bit easier. Excellent. Anybody else? You were going to say something?
It's like helpful to hear other sides, like use it for your own argument.
Yes, that's true. You listen to their arguments and you think, yes, I could use those arguments. Anybody else?
I think hearing what everyone else has to say makes you strengthen what your point of view is, because you get to argue against what they're saying.
Yes, other students have said that in other places as well. Great. Anybody else?
Like being able to debate it really like makes you understand what you're debating, and like when you debate it with someone else, you get to see their point of view, and that kind of like you can add that to your argument, or you can think of ways which you can argue against that.
Yes.
So it really helps that way.
It helps develop your thinking that way, doesn't it? Because you're constantly having to think, oh yes, maybe I could look at it from a different perspective, but maybe I can come back and add to that. Okay, thank you very much for your remarks. I've enjoyed listening to you. Okay.
Now we started off a little bit cold when we were looking at the continuum, when we were looking at somewhere between the provisional government and the weaknesses of the provisional government, all the way up to sort of the positives associated with Bolshevism, particularly this idea of organisation, particularly this idea of taking all the good stuff about Lenin, the meticulous organisation and attention to detail, but adding this sort of populist flavour to it. And it was this, a few of you talked, not in these languages, but you talked about this symbiotic relationship between the two, how one was failing while the other one was succeeding as a result of the failure. So actually, that was really interesting. Now what I'd like you to do is, having done a little bit of reading, having done a little bit of speaking, I'd now like you to return to the continuum with your second photo. And I'd like you to place where you've moved to. All right, now you're...
If you have, I suppose people might.
If people have moved their opinion at all, okay, so... So we wanted to differentiate between your initial position, Kieran. We wanted to differentiate between your initial position, which is your ordinary school photo, and the Russian expert photo. So if you'd like to return to the continuum and see whether or not you've moved to your opinion at all.
There we go.
Yeah.
I'm still very I don't think I'm not really any further than that.
Let's have a look. So we've got Lewis, who absolutely has not changed at all. Lewis, do you want to explain, having spoken to people and having done some reading, why you're absolutely convinced still that it's down to the weaknesses of the provisional government?
I just feel that, from what I've heard and what I've sort of debated, that although like the Bolsheviks, they have such such strong leaders like Lenin, I don't feel that they would be able to capitalise on like the provisional government couldn't have like collapsed without places for it to be capitalised upon, without weaknesses, so like them pushing like unpopular policies, them being made of a loose coalition of parties that they keep changing and sort of splitting. So I feel like it's only because of these weaknesses that Lenin's able to exploit this, and that's what really sort of broke them apart. Okay,
now notice that almost everybody has changed slightly. So we've got Stephen's just changed slightly. Some people have gone radically altered. Now, if you look at the questions we've got on the board, have you changed position? We can see that quite clearly. Did the reading have any effect on anybody? Did you read and think, actually, yeah, I don't think I got that quite right? Nobody was... So it strengthened that you're absolutely right the first time. What about the other group? Talking to the other people, was anybody particularly swayed by the opinions of other people, listening to other people and actually having heard their opinion and thought, yeah, actually they're right? Emily, you're nodding a little bit.
Yeah.
What was it that changed your opinion?
Because it's like, so talking to somebody else on the opposite side of the argument, it helps to like realise that that's better than your point of view, if that makes sense.
No, that absolutely makes sense. Yeah, I mean that's the whole point of the exercise, is to hear two sides and hear it from different people as well is important as well. Let's have a look who else has changed quite. So Michael, you've moved even more towards weaknesses of the provisional government.
Well, from what I heard from people and what I read, it just seems like it wasn't actually the Bolsheviks really doing anything. All they did was just exploited things that the provisional government was already failing on. They weren't listening to the people. They were already hated by most of the people. So it really just needed someone. And it didn't have to be Lenin. It just had to be someone who was willing to listen and adapt to the situation. And it really didn't need to be someone as strong as Lenin. It could have been anyone really. Just to capitalise on how weak it actually was at the time.
Now, if I remember rightly, you did the Lenin reading, and that didn't sort of.
Oh no, I did Bolshevik. Sorry, I was being.
Yeah, so you're pro-Bolshevik.
Oh, yeah.
So even though you'd done that reading, you were still absolutely convinced that you had the confidence to argue against that point as well. Okay, that's really interesting.
It is interesting. I'll just tell you a little bit more about this activity. It's the first time I've done it in such a concrete form. But this activity, working out line of argument, was developed by Queen Mary University, London. And they did so because the tutors teaching the first year undergraduates at university found it difficult to develop a line of argument. So you're doing a piece of work that was developed for undergraduates. And history in particular is a subject where it's important to have a line of argument and not just state the facts. History is always a question of interpretation, basically, is what we're saying. But it would also apply to subjects like sociology, other social science subjects, English. Is anybody doing English? Yes. I think you'd agree, or certainly Miss Holly would agree that.
I'd say any essay subject, and thinking about your coursework, which is obviously the thing that you're going to all be doing all over the summer, having a line of argument is absolutely, you cannot achieve the highest grades unless you do get off the fence and argue one point. I was talking to Lewis yesterday about that.
So we are really encouraging you not to be at the midpoint, but to be on one side of this fence and argue. It will make your job easier as well, in a way, if you have an argument. You can marshal your arguments. You must obviously mention the other side as well, and also state why they're not as important. Okay, we're going to move on to some...
I think it's you next.
It's me next, yeah. We need to go to the next slide. Yeah, okay. All right then, so we're going to go on to writing line of argument. Just quickly draw your attention to this. Can you see? Can you see the board okay? Can you read it? Shall we put the lights?
Will you be able to see okay?
Let's try it.
Oh, I've just done it slightly. Okay,
yeah, that's fine.
So these are just slight differences in expression, which I'm sure you'll notice. I've gone too far now, haven't I? It needs to go to previous. Okay, version 1. I believe that the Bolsheviks won in October 2017 primarily because of their intrinsic strength and not because the opposition was weak. Or version 2. The Bolsheviks took power in October 2017.
1917.
Oh gosh, sorry. Oh, just a century out.
That's okay, you're looking into the future, 3 months into the future.
Mainly due to their own intrinsic strength, rather than the weakness of the opposition. Do you want to just talk to the person next to you for a minute about the differences in style, and then I'll be asking you. Sorry, you're on your own here, you can talk to Sir.
Here.
What's the difference?
I feel like version 2
Yeah, it was a little bit.
Version 2 is better. Why is it?
Which one is less confident?
Yeah, you're right.
This is like you can from version 2 you can get through you don't have to put the I believe, you don't have to put the I believe in order to get a line of argument put across. You can assert your opinion through.
We were saying on this table here that we think that version 2 is better, it's more formally expressed, because we didn't like, what didn't we like very much?
I believe.
Yeah, we didn't like I believe very much. And what else didn't we like very much?
And not because.
Yeah, we're not very keen on not because. So in the second version we have the Bolsheviks to power, and we have rather than, yeah. So we've changed those two things. We are trying to encourage you, Mr. Blunt is trying to encourage you, to write in an impersonal style rather than the personal style, to avoid the first person. This says the same thing, but impersonally, by the emphasis falling on the Bolsheviks took power. and then rather than. There are some nice things here too. I think primarily because is quite well expressed. So it's not terrible, it's just not quite as good. Okay.
I think with the first one, it's more black and white. It leads to that sort of black and white,
True.
rather than, particularly with this sort of symbiotic
You're absolutely right, actually.
relationship between,
Yeah.
there is validity to the other argument, but actually I'm going to argue this one.
That's right, because that's very black and white, and not because. And rather than is more of a balance, it's more nuanced, and that is better. Okay, shall we go on to the next one? Okay, so this is our advice to you. Summed up, produce a line of argument, don't sit on the fence. It's fine to mention the other side. You could compare using rather than, in that one, or as opposed to is also a very good connective. And use in personal and formal language and avoid using the first person. Okay, and I think, I saw some of your writing last time. I was quite impressed. I think you're already writing well as a group. So it's a question of moving from already writing quite well to writing even better. So hit those top grades.
Absolutely. Now
Okay.
I've got some pens around.
Now we're going to ask you to write now the introduction to the essay. The essay question, is it on the next slide?
I
I'm
can
not
put
sure
it on
actually. Yeah, it is indeed on the next one. Okay, great. So you can, if you wish, work on your own, or if you wish, you could work on the whiteboards. It'd be nice if some people did. Big paper like A3. But I think that's really nice.
Luckily, I've got a set ready.
I'll write it now. Yeah, I suppose. We can change it later on, we can write it out.
Yes, you led.
Oh, it says over correct question. Alright, yeah.
1979. What? No, 1917. Led.
Due to the fact that, due to the weakness of the provisional government,
Bolsheviks to capitalise.
and then allowed list some of the reasons they were weak. So not list, but explain some of the reasons they were weak in more detail.
I want to say, we can put pushing the British chain there. The pushing, they were given the opportunity of unpopular policies. I'm going to put in brackets, continuation.
Introduction. October Revolution was merely a, what's this word? We don't need merely. It was a prime example. Merely undercuts your argument, yes? Merely. So the October Revolution was a prime example of the extent of provisional government. The extent of the provisional government's what? Right, I want that here then.
Growing popularity and their ability to adapt to increasing social situations.
Okay, and I'm saying stop there.
The fact that he changes his tactics. He keeps the bits that are good, this idea of absolute meticulous fine detail. Everything is absolutely, when he eventually comes to overthrow them in October, everything is ticked off. So we take the Winter Palace, we take the railways, we take the means of communication, all those things, rather than sort of this rioting that we see in the July days. So again, just briefly mention the parameters that you're going to be, if I was to read the rest of your essay, where would I be seeing the Bolsheviks being so successful throughout 1917, right?
Or is that going to say too many provisional governments? I'll put it for general competence. Yeah, we can
As soon as we get it, just general competence government.
Such as focusing on the war?
No, it's not politics.
Oh, yeah.
Say that as another thing. That they ignored the people, so they introduced things that people didn't like.
But they also introduced, combined with ignoring.
Absolutely mucked up the June offensive, leading to mass desertions, etc. And the Kornilov affair was just dreadful. So again, in your essay, I know that those are at least 5 paragraphs that I'm going to see, because you're going to have. So think about that when you're thinking about the Bolsheviks. You're absolutely right. There's nothing wrong with it. Where were they well organised? What did they do? All right.
Okay.
1917, the Bolsheviks were only able to overthrow the provisional government due to the weaknesses of the government as opposed to the strengths of the Bolsheviks. Yeah, okay. I think that was it's concise and it sums up the argument. Okay. And I asked the boys to stop there. This was originally part of that sentence, but it makes it a bit unwieldy if they add more information. And sorry, I didn't get your name.
Oh, Michael.
Michael went on to say that in the next part he would unpick this, the unpopular policies, in the next part of the essay to develop the thinking there. So I think that's very good.
Now, there's a couple of things we can see straight away. Clearly addressing the question is important, whether it's writing a long piece of coursework or whether it's writing an essay of two or three sides in an exam. The first parameter on each of the mark schemes for essays is always clearly addresses the question, and sort of grades of associated with the question. So to be directly addressing the question is really important. I'll put a couple of green ticks over there with although, because again, although in an introduction or a conclusion suggests that balance, that you know that there are other sides to it, you're going to be addressing those other sides to it, but it's really important that you stick to that one argument, that one central argument. Okay, and this, when you're writing your coursework, have an opinion, understand the alternative opinions, try and break them down all the time. And the other thing with an introduction is to set what we're going to read in the essay. So we're going to know the argument, that it's the weaknesses of the provisional government or it's the strengths of the Bolsheviks. Where are we going to see that in your paragraphs? And we're just thinking of some ideas, we're just talking to the girls here about where are you going to prove to me that the leadership of Bolsheviks was, displayed itself. So we think about, from day one, not being tarred with a provisional government, not getting involved with it at all. The April thesis, the change of, and all those sorts of things that we're going to read in the essay. Don't need to go into massive detail. All right, detail will come later on when you start to explore it in your essay. So just to be setting a few little key pointers that we know where we're going to be heading to.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we were impressed with the quality of writing, but just wanted to reinforce not to load too much into that opening sentence, to keep it punchy if you can. Yes, I think this one works well. The Bolsheviks were able to overthrow the provisional government in 1917, mainly due to their intrinsic strengths as opposed to the weaknesses of the government. I think that's well expressed. And I like the one at the back as well. The weaknesses of the provisional government in October 1917 allowed the Bolsheviks to seize power.
Simple, answers the question.
Addresses the question. I mean, I picked those two. There were several others as well. So just think about that topic sentence, not to overload it, because you will have room, as Sir said, to expand your arguments later in the paragraph and later in the essay. I think that brings today's session very
well. Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, students. You've done a great job. Okay, so how did you think it went today?
Yeah, I thought it went really well. At first, they were obviously conscious of the cameras and some of the responses were quite muted. But actually drawing the learning out of them started to appear. But it was the confidence that they got from academic reading followed by being able to articulate that to another student, I thought was really good.
Yes, I thought so too. I mean, I couldn't circulate quite as much as I would like to, but the snippets I heard were good, the things like Lenin was able to exploit the weaknesses of the government. And I could see that they were relaxing into it and using more hand gestures and so on.
There was one student who had actually changed opinion based on the other person, which was really interesting as well, just from talking, even though he had the knowledge about Lenin, it changed his opinion totally because the other argument was put across so convincingly.
So persuasively. Really, who was that?
That was Kieran when he was talking to Emily.
Oh, that's really good. Yeah, and Emily had also shifted her opinion as well.
Yeah.
So that is really good because we want to make them feel that they have the right to have an opinion in history and English. They are, budding historians.
But it's also important that they change their mind, that they're open enough to be able to change their mind, not to have this totally fixed mindset, but also...
But also, it doesn't have to be fixed, but that it's important maybe to have a stance.
Yeah, but what I was going to say was actually appreciating the other side of the opinion as well, not just to write a completely one-sided argument, having the difference between sort of a polemic argument, which is just merely one side, and actually understanding, appreciating the validity of other arguments, but being able to break those down and argue forcefully for one side.
If you can do that, you've really cracked it at A level,
absolutely.
haven't you? I mean, it's not an easy skill.
No, it's not.
No, but I really like the way that Continuum was set up concretely in front of them. I haven't done that before. I think it's a nice way to do it, because in the past I've done it on an A3 sheet, and they've had positions along that. But in future I'll be doing it in the way we did it today. I think that was really nice way
I've done it where I've just got students to point at.
Okay.
So pointing out the window and the door, and they've got to come up with their opinion for a start and see if they change just by pointing. But actually to have their faces there and see they're very, very different was far more powerful.
I think they'll remember it, which is good. And I think the last thing is, I know this is the end of this current cycle, but it was very interesting to go around and see that joint writing at the end. And if I was doing another session, I'd be looking at topic sentences, because some people had the knack of, the succinct, well-expressed ones, and others, there was a boy working on his own.
Saif, yeah.
Yeah, Saif, and his sentence was quite long and meandering, so he would benefit from something like that. But overall, I thought they're confident students and really responsive.
Without a doubt. I mean, they're a really good group anyway.
Yeah, yes.
But it's strange because the boys are very, they're very good written history as well, but they're very confident to be able to articulate. But the girls, who often are quite reserved, their writing displays a lot of those things.
Those qualities, yes.
But we've got, I'd say, probably about 4 or 5 who are struggling to make that jump from GCSE to A level, to be able to write in a way that is academic. That's focused on the past tense about what did happen and those sorts of things.
Yes.
And constantly going over those is important.
Yes, and if we had a longer time frame, we could break down those writing skills in more detail. We've looked at writing strong paragraphs, and we've looked at writing a powerful introduction. So I think that's the direction I would take it in. But I think it was a good start. And go on.
I mean, I'd just say they're currently just at the planning stage of the coursework as well. To be able to come up with an argument.
Yeah. Very important.
That strongly, obviously in an extended introduction, I think is important skill for them to be going through now. So.
Yes, that's good. So it sets the scene for the work, their independent study over the summer, and it's good. You mentioned this earlier, but tying it into academic reading and that focused note making, not the sort of I'm going to read this and I'm going to highlight everything I can see, but focused note taking is important too, isn't it?
And again, if they read those academic articles, you can see from the first sentence, you can see quite clearly what the argument is, very, very simply.
Yeah.
And to be able to read that and start to take on board the way that academic writing is sort of produced when you're making an argument is important.